They took vows of chastity, obedience, and poverty, sworn to a life of devotion behind cloistered walls. But what happens when those sacred walls conceal dark secrets? Imagine a convent where the silence isn't just about prayer, but about hidden pregnancies, buried babies, and unbearable guilt. This isn't fiction. These are real stories, painful, hidden truths that have remained buried for decades. Former nuns are finally breaking their silence, revealing how abuse, manipulation, and institutional cover-ups shattered countless lives. In this video, we uncover documented cases and haunting personal testimonies of nuns who became pregnant behind convent walls. We explore how fear, shame, and blind obedience were weaponized to protect power, while the victims were silenced. If you're drawn to truth, even when it's uncomfortable, stay with us. Like this video, subscribe and turn on notifications. And tell us in the comments, should religious institutions be held legally accountable for decades-old hidden crimes? It often starts with innocence. A young woman, full of faith and devotion, enters a convent with a heart bursting with hope. She's seeking a higher calling, a place where she can belong, where she can serve God, away from the noise of the world. The convent promises purity, simplicity, and spiritual discipline. It promises safety, but for some, behind the stone walls and beneath the silence, that promise turns into something far darker. Maria was only 19 when she joined the convent. The year was 1982. She had grown up in a deeply religious family in southern Italy, where her parents considered her entrance into the religious life the highest honor. The day she took her vows, she said she felt like she was marrying God. She wore white, and the community rejoiced. But within a year, Maria was pregnant. She never saw it coming. The man responsible wasn't a stranger, nor was it a romantic relationship gone too far. It was the priest assigned to hear confessions, a man revered by the sisters and trusted by the church. He was gentle at first, kind, a spiritual father. Then came the small touches, the comments about her inner beauty, the invitation to private prayer sessions. When he assaulted her in the chapel, Maria froze. She said nothing. She went to confession, ashamed. And he was there, behind the screen, asking her what she'd done to tempt him. Maria's story isn't an isolated one. As we peel back the layers of this hidden world, what we find is deeply disturbing, not just because of the abuse itself, but because of the silence that followed. Convents across Europe, South America, Africa, and even parts of North America have been implicated in allegations of sexual abuse, forced pregnancies, and, most chillingly, forced secrecy. And yes, in some cases, buried babies. In 2019, the Vatican publicly acknowledged for the first time that nuns had been sexually abused by priests and bishops, and in some instances, forced to have abortions or carry pregnancies in silence. The acknowledgement came decades too late for many victims, but it cracked open a door that had been locked for centuries. What makes these stories so complex is the deep intertwining of faith and fear. For many nuns, obedience isn't just a virtue, it's a commandment. To question authority is to risk damnation. So when they are assaulted or manipulated by those in power, priests, bishops, or even senior nuns, they often blame themselves. Sister Catherine, from a convent in Ireland, told her story in 2003, long before any public acknowledgement from the Vatican. She had kept her secret for 36 years. She became pregnant after repeated assaults by a visiting cleric. When her pregnancy began to show, she was quietly removed from the convent. The official explanation to the other sisters was that she was mentally unwell and needed rest. She gave birth alone in a church-run clinic and was told the baby would be placed with a good family. She never saw her child again. Years later, she discovered that her baby had died shortly after birth. She wasn't told where the baby was buried. No ceremony, no grave. She wasn't allowed to mourn. What's most haunting is not just the abuse, but the deliberate effort to erase it. Testimonies from former convent staff reveal a system built to protect the institution at all costs. Pregnant nuns were often hidden, isolated in recovery homes, or transferred to distant convents. In some cases, their babies were taken and adopted through church-run networks without consent, documentation, or accountability. Many nuns who spoke out were punished, silenced, excommunicated. And for those who stayed silent, the weight of guilt and fear became a prison, even thicker than stone walls. We might ask ourselves, how could this happen? How could a place dedicated to love, mercy, and truth become a space where such atrocities were hidden? Part of the answer lies in the culture of blind obedience. When a woman becomes a nun, she takes a vow not just of chastity and poverty, but of submission. Her life is no longer her own. Her body, her will, her thoughts, even her questions are surrendered to God through the institution. In theory, this is a spiritual offering. In practice, it can become dangerous. Within this structure, powerful men, often immune from scrutiny, could operate without fear. And they did. And when a nun did fall pregnant, willingly or not, she bore the burden alone. You might wonder, why didn't they run? Why not escape, call the police, expose the truth? But escape wasn't simple. Many convents were closed communities. The outside world was forbidden. Most nuns didn't have money, identification, or even knowledge of how to contact legal authorities. And beyond that, there was something far stronger keeping them inside: shame. To break the silence was to betray everything they had vowed to protect: the church, the image of holiness, their own sense of spiritual worth. Many were convinced that they were the sinners, not the abusers, not the ones who covered it up. They were told their pregnancy was a punishment for hidden pride, that their suffering would redeem others, that silence was sacred, and so the stories were buried, just like the babies. In a chilling 1994 case from France, a mass grave was discovered behind a former convent that had been closed for decades. Investigators found the remains of infants, some as young as a few days old. There was no public record of their existence, no official explanation. The church called it a tragic chapter and moved on. But for former sisters like Lucia from Argentina, the pain never left. Lucia became pregnant in 1978. She was 23, and the result of a relationship with a local priest who convinced her that their union was blessed in secret. When she became visibly pregnant, she was taken from the convent at night, placed in a car, and driven to a remote countryside house where she remained for 5 months. She gave birth to a boy. The child was taken without her consent. She was told it was God's will. Lucia left the church the following year. She's still searching for her son. As the years pass and more women come forward, the full scope of this tragedy is still being uncovered. These are not isolated incidents. They point to a pattern, a systemic culture of secrecy, where the image of holiness was prioritized over the lives of the women who upheld it. And here's the harshest truth. Many of these stories were known by church authorities. Internal memos, sealed testimonies, and private Vatican reports have confirmed that certain bishops and cardinals were aware and chose silence. Some of the most chilling documents come from the 1970s and 80s, in which internal Vatican correspondence refers to problematic pregnancies within religious communities. The language is cold, clinical. No mention of abuse, no mention of the women. Only the need to protect the dignity of the institution. Let that sink in. And now we ask, what do we do with this knowledge? For those of us outside the walls of the convent, how do we respond? Do we turn away, convinced this was a tragedy of the past? Or do we demand accountability from an institution that still holds power over millions? And for those who were victims, who still carry the weight of silence, shame, or lost children, what does justice look like? There are no easy answers. But there is power in truth. In telling these stories, we honor those who couldn't speak, we remember the forgotten, and we demand better. because silence, no matter how sacred it pretends to be, should never protect abuse. If you're still here, watching this, then you care. And that matters. If this story moved you or even unsettled you, take a moment to like this video. Subscribe to our channel for more hidden truths. And tell us in the comments, do you believe the Church should release all historical documents related to these cases, even if it damages its reputation? Should the victims receive formal reparations? Your voice matters, more than you think. When we think about a nun, we often picture a serene figure in a black habit, hands folded in prayer, someone who has chosen to renounce the world in pursuit of spiritual perfection. That image is comforting. It's clean. But the stories we're uncovering show us that behind that image lies a very different reality for many. Not all convents were sanctuaries. For some, they were cages. Anna, who entered a convent in the Philippines in the early 1990s, described it as a place of deep spiritual hunger. She wanted to be closer to God, and she believed the convent would be where she could hear his voice more clearly. What she heard instead, in whispered rumors between sisters, were names of priests who had visited and never returned, names of girls who suddenly disappeared, warnings wrapped in silence. She didn't believe them until it happened to her. She was 21 when the chaplain of her convent began visiting her during evening meditations. At first, he spoke softly about her light, about how the Holy Spirit moved in her. Then came the compliments, the gifts, the private conversations cloaked as spiritual counseling. One night, during a supposed deliverance prayer, he assaulted her. She told no one, not because she didn't want to, but because she feared she wouldn't be believed. And she was right. When she finally confided in the Mother Superior, the response chilled her. You must be confusing spiritual intimacy with worldly temptation. Repent, and the Lord will cleanse you. The man continued his visits. She began to avoid him. Her tasks at the convent became harder. She was given the most difficult duties, isolated from the other sisters. Her meals were reduced. She was being punished, without words. And when her pregnancy became known, she was quietly expelled. Her belongings were packed for her. A bus ticket was given. No support, no apology. Just a suggestion that she return to her family and ask for forgiveness. She was 8 months pregnant when she boarded the bus alone. Anna now works with a non-profit helping women who've left religious institutions under similar circumstances. She says the hardest part isn't healing the trauma. It's teaching them that it wasn't their fault, because so many still believe it was. That belief that they brought it upon themselves is a weapon more effective than any walls or locks. It's internalized, deep, and it keeps victims silent for years, sometimes decades. One nun, who goes by the pseudonym Clare, shared her story only after 40 years. She had been part of a convent in Canada in the 1960s. She never spoke publicly until she saw another survivor's interview on TV. That was the moment she realized she wasn't alone. Clare had been 24 when she was raped by a visiting priest during a retreat. She never told anyone. When she became pregnant, the Mother Superior arranged for her to be transferred to another location for health reasons. She gave birth in a Catholic-run hospital. Her baby was taken immediately and put up for adoption. She was never allowed to see the child, not even once. When she asked, they told her it was better not to get attached. Clare remained in the convent for another 10 years before she finally left. She never married, never had more children. How could I, she said, when I'd already lost the only one I had, and I wasn't even allowed to grieve? That's a theme we've heard over and over. Not just the violation of their bodies, but the theft of their grief. The Church often speaks of compassion, mercy, and healing. But in these cases, those values were denied to the very women who devoted their lives to embodying them. Instead of protection, they received exile. Instead of love, shame. Instead of justice, silence. The idea that this only happened in the past is comforting, but it may not be true. In recent years, more stories have emerged from convents still in operation, where young nuns speak of ongoing coercion and abuse. The power dynamics haven't changed. The systems of silence are still in place, and in some parts of the world, especially where poverty and illiteracy are high, these women remain some of the most vulnerable. What's worse is that many of the mechanisms that enabled this abuse, forced confessions, hierarchical obedience, lack of oversight, are still regarded as sacred tradition, and questioning them is seen as rebellion against God himself. So how do we reconcile faith with failure? Is it possible to believe in the good that the Church has done while also acknowledging the horrific harm it has caused? That question cuts deep for many believers. Because when we expose corruption within a religious institution, it feels like we're attacking the faith itself. But the truth is, they're not the same. Faith is personal, sacred, untouchable, but institutions are made by people, and people can fall. Recognizing abuse doesn't weaken faith, it protects it. It ensures that the faith we hand down to future generations is built on truth, not cover-ups. And yet, for many victims, even the act of speaking out feels like a betrayal. That's how deeply the culture of silence has rooted itself. That's how effective it has been. Sister Agnes, who now lives in Germany, described her struggle with this guilt. She was assaulted in the 1980s by a bishop who visited their convent regularly. When she reported it to her superior, she was asked to reflect on whether she had provoked temptation. After that, her life became unbearable. Her duties tripled. She was forced into weeks of fasting and prayer as penance. She developed chronic anxiety and eventually left the order. But it took her more than 30 years to say the words out loud. "It was not my fault." She said those words only after attending a retreat for former nuns who were survivors of abuse. There she met others, dozens of them, with stories like hers, different countries, different decades, but the same silence, the same shame. The retreat was run by a grassroots organization called the Lost Sisters. Founded by 3 ex-nuns from Brazil, Ireland, and Kenya, the group offers support, counseling and advocacy for women who left religious life under traumatic circumstances. They've documented over 1,200 cases from more than 40 countries, and the numbers keep growing. Their work has drawn criticism from some church leaders who accuse them of spreading anti-religious propaganda. But the founders insist they're not against the church, they're for the women who were forgotten by it. And perhaps that's the real scandal, not just the abuse, but the forgetting. When an institution forgets its victims, when it buries its dead without names, when it demands silence in place of sorrow, it betrays the very principles it claims to uphold. This is not about vengeance, it's about remembrance, because every buried baby had a name, every silenced woman had a voice, every stolen childhood mattered. So what now? Should the church be held criminally accountable? Should it pay reparations? Should high-ranking clergy be prosecuted for decades-old crimes? That's a question many legal systems are wrestling with right now. In some countries, statutes of limitations prevent older cases from going to court, but others are reopening investigations, especially when new evidence or witnesses emerge. In Ireland, Chile, and parts of Africa, independent inquiries have revealed patterns of abuse in both convents and church-run homes. One report from Argentina found that in a single diocese, over a dozen nuns had been removed from their orders after becoming pregnant. In most cases, the fathers were priests. None of them faced canonical punishment. Most were simply relocated. Relocation, the classic maneuver. Rather than confront abuse, the abuser is moved to another parish, another convent, another country. The victims are left behind. But what happens to the children? That's one of the most heartbreaking pieces of this puzzle. Some of the babies born in convents were placed in church-run orphanages. Others were quietly adopted out, often to Catholic families who never knew the child's origin. Records were rarely kept. Mothers were often told to forget, but they didn't forget. There are former nuns today who are searching for their children, and children now adults who are searching for their mothers. DNA registries are beginning to bridge those gaps. Some have reunited, others never will. And yet, for every reunion, there's a question that lingers. Why did no one stop this? Why was the system so committed to silence rather than justice? Perhaps the answer lies in control. Silence protects control. Control protects image, and image protects power. But when the image becomes more important than the people it serves, something sacred is lost. We can't undo the past, but we can face it. We can honor the courage of those who speak out. We can amplify their voices, and we can refuse to look away. Because silence is comfortable, it's easy, but truth is sacred. If you've made it this far, it means you care. Take a moment to support this work. Like the video so others can find it. Subscribe to the channel if you believe these stories deserve to be heard. And leave us a comment. Do you think the church should release all adoption records connected to convent pregnancies, even if it implicates members of the clergy? We want to hear your voice. To truly understand how so many women, intelligent, faithful, strong, were silenced for decades, we need to understand the psychological prison that often replaced the physical walls of a convent. Obedience, when taken to extremes, becomes a weapon. And in many convents, especially those that followed strict monastic rule, obedience wasn't just encouraged, it was absolute. Questioning your superior, doubting a priest's instructions, or speaking about your experiences without permission wasn't seen as a personal mistake. It was framed as spiritual rebellion, as disobedience not to a human, but to God Himself. Imagine the pressure. You're a young woman who has dedicated her life to what you believe is a divine calling. You're in a community where every moment is structured around prayer, silence, and submission. And then one day, something horrific happens. You're touched without consent, you're coerced, you're impregnated. But when you attempt to speak up, the very people you trust, the ones who claim to represent God, accuse you of sin, of weakness, of seduction. That kind of spiritual gaslighting leaves wounds far deeper than any scar. Sister Elena from Spain experienced exactly that. She was only 20 when she was assigned to care for a priest who was staying in the convent due to illness. At first, he praised her dedication. He called her a light among sisters. But as the days went by, he began inviting her to sit longer with him, to pray privately. Then one evening, while she cleaned his room, he forced himself on her. She cried silently, ashamed, confused, not even sure how to name what had happened. When she confided in an older nun, she was told to pray harder, to fast, to cleanse her soul. No support, no protection, only guilt. When she became pregnant months later, the same nun who had silenced her escorted her to a small Catholic-run facility in the countryside. She gave birth there under a false name. The baby was taken the next morning. No explanation, no goodbyes. Eleanor was returned to the convent and told never to speak of the incident again. She didn't, for 30 years. When she finally spoke, it wasn't to a priest or a bishop, it was to a journalist. And it changed everything. Her testimony led to a quiet investigation within the diocese. The results were never made public, but insiders reported that at least 5 other nuns in that same convent had given birth over a span of 10 years. None of the children were registered. None of the priests were punished. The system had worked, just not for the victims. Stories like Elena's highlight something else, the complicity not just of men in power, but of women trained to uphold the same toxic systems. Older nuns, tasked with maintaining order, often became enforcers of silence, not out of cruelty, but because they, too, had been broken by the system. Many had their own stories. Many had endured the same pain, but they had survived by suppressing it, by convincing themselves it was God's will. This generational trauma created an ecosystem where abuse could thrive, hidden in plain sight. And what about the children? The ones born behind convent walls? Some were placed in adoption networks run by religious institutions. Others were raised in orphanages under strict conditions, told nothing about their origins. A few were even sent to families connected to church benefactors, where records were altered or destroyed. One such child, now an adult named Lucas, began searching for his mother at the age of 34. He had always known he was adopted, but his file had no information, just a date and a location. A private maternity home, once owned by a religious order in Portugal. Years of searching led him nowhere until a DNA test linked him to a distant cousin who confirmed a family story about a nun who had gone away for a while in the late 80s. That woman, Sister Marissa, had left the convent shortly after Lucas's birth. She never married, never spoke of the baby she was told had died shortly after delivery. But when they met again, both of them wept. Neither had expected the other to still be searching. Lucas's story is one of rare closure. But for many, the trail ends in darkness. Institutions often claim that records were lost, that no documentation exists. But former insiders have revealed that many of these files were deliberately destroyed or hidden under aliases, locked in church archives, never meant to be accessed. What does this mean for justice? In Italy, a recent legal battle brought these questions into the spotlight. A woman named Rosa sued the religious order where she had lived as a young nun, claiming psychological abuse and the illegal removal of her child. The case dragged on for years, with the church denying all wrongdoing. But in a surprising twist, the court ruled in her favor, not for the criminal charges, but for emotional damages. It was the first time such a case had resulted in compensation. But Rosa didn't want the money. She wanted her child's name, and that information was still missing. The legal fight continues, and with it the movement grows. More and more former nuns, children and advocates are demanding access to sealed records, calling for official apologies, and urging the Vatican to open an international inquiry into convent pregnancies and cover-ups. Yet resistance remains strong. Within many church circles, there's still a fear that admitting these truths will harm the faithful, that people will lose their belief, that they'll turn away from God. But the reality is this: hiding the truth is what does the most damage. Faith built on lies is no faith at all. And for many, hearing these stories is not about losing belief. It's about reclaiming it. It's about understanding that true spirituality cannot exist without justice, that the God of mercy and compassion cannot be represented by a system that punishes victims and protects abusers. Some argue that things are different now, that reforms have been made, that the church has learned. But has it? A 2022 report in South America revealed that at least 6 religious homes still operated under complete isolation, where young women were brought in for spiritual reformation and kept for years, often with no contact with the outside world. The report included testimonies from former residents who described psychological manipulation, forced labor, and in one case, a pregnancy that was handled internally. The names of the institutions were redacted. No charges were filed. This is why the conversation can't stop. This is why we must keep asking questions, because even now, somewhere in the world, a young woman might be kneeling in a convent chapel, terrified of the life growing inside her, convinced she has sinned, unsure if she will ever be allowed to speak her truth, and she needs to know she's not alone. We say their names, we tell their stories, not to shame the church, but to call it to its highest values: truth, compassion, redemption. These women, these children, these families, they deserve that. If you've stayed with us this long, thank you. It means you're not afraid to face difficult truths. It means you understand that behind every scandal, there are real people, real pain, and a desperate need for healing. Please like this video if you believe stories like these should be known. Subscribe for more investigations into forgotten voices and untold truths. Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the Vatican should open a global investigation into convent pregnancies and release all sealed archives? Or do you believe some truths are better left in the past? Let's talk about it together. It's easy to imagine that stories like these belong to a different era, tucked away in the shadowy corridors of history, wrapped in habits and silence. But one of the most disturbing realities is how recent many of these cases are. We're not only talking about the 1940s or 50s. Many of these pregnancies, cover-ups and abuses happened in the 90s, the early 2000s, and some, even more chillingly, are still being reported today. In 2018, a nun in India made headlines when she accused a bishop of repeated rape over the course of 2 years. Her case shook the church in India, not just because of the accusation, but because of the coordinated effort to silence her. She was isolated, discredited, subjected to invasive questioning, not just by church officials, but by police who questioned whether she had led him on. The bishop denied all charges and was later acquitted, but the case spotlighted a cultural pattern. When a nun speaks up, the machinery of doubt activates instantly. That nun, Sister Lucy, was later expelled from her order, not because she had done something wrong, but because she spoke out. She became a symbol, not just for justice, but for rebellion against a system that demanded silence at any cost. And she wasn't alone. All over the world, nuns who have dared to speak about abuse, about pregnancies, about institutional failure, have been met with the same response. You are disobedient, you are dangerous, you are no longer welcome here. That response reveals something crucial. The church often treats the exposure of abuse as a greater sin than the abuse itself. Why? Because image is everything. The image of moral superiority, the image of sacred purity, the image of a spotless institution leading souls to salvation. To acknowledge that this same institution harbored abuse, sometimes encouraged it, often protected the abusers, is to fracture that image. And for those in power, that image has become an idol. But what about the image of a woman sobbing alone in a hospital hallway, begging to hold the child she just delivered, only to be told, "No, you don't get to say goodbye"? What about the image of a child growing up without answers, looking in the mirror and wondering, where did I come from? Why did she leave me? These are the images that matter. These are the realities that the glossy surface of holiness has tried to erase. One former nun, who now goes by the name Teresa, shared a story that is difficult to hear, but it must be told. She entered religious life in South America when she was only 17. The convent offered shelter from a life of poverty and violence, but within 2 years, she was pregnant. The father was a visiting deacon who had become a regular presence at their chapel. When the pregnancy was discovered, the convent contacted a nearby bishop. Teresa was removed in the dead of night, taken to a Catholic hospital, and given a high dose of medication intended to terminate the pregnancy. She was never asked. She was told it was a medical necessity. She survived. The baby did not. That experience shattered her faith, but it didn't destroy her will. She left the convent months later, broke her silence years later, and now speaks publicly about reproductive coercion within religious institutions. Her story is not just about violence, it's about control. About the ways that spiritual authority was used to dominate her choices, her body, her very sense of self. And she's not alone. In parts of Africa and Asia, there are still communities where young women are recruited into religious life with promises of education and spiritual fulfillment, only to be cut off from their families, isolated, and subjected to systems of control that leave them vulnerable to abuse. In some cases, church-run seminaries and novitiates function almost like closed compounds. No visitors, no outside communication. And if something happens, if a pregnancy occurs, there is no investigation, only relocation, only silence. When asked why these cases haven't triggered larger global inquiries, one Vatican official reportedly said, "There is no need to open old wounds." But these wounds aren't old, and they haven't healed. They're open, bleeding, alive in the lives of survivors still searching for justice, for answers, for acknowledgement. And we must ask, what would healing even look like? For many survivors, it starts with being heard. For decades, their stories were dismissed as exaggerations, as lies, as the delusions of disgruntled ex-nuns. But today, those voices are growing stronger. They're being documented, recorded, shared. Books, podcasts, documentaries, all of these have become lifelines, but they've also become battlegrounds. Because with every story told, the resistance grows. There are still powerful voices within the church that insist these women are out to destroy what is sacred, that their memories are false, that their motivations are political, that their pain is inconvenient. But truth doesn't depend on convenience. And if we claim to follow a God who sees the forgotten, who hears the cries of the oppressed, who lifts the lowly, then we must believe these stories matter. In 2020, an anonymous collective of former nuns launched an online archive dedicated to gathering testimonies from women who became pregnant during religious life. The site allows users to share anonymously, to upload documents, and to connect with others. It has become a quiet revolution, an underground movement of memory. Through it, stories have emerged from convents in Mexico, Poland, Kenya, the United States, and even the Vatican City itself. Each story different, each one the same: a woman, a vow, a violation, a pregnancy, a removal, a silence, and often a child lost, sometimes to death, sometimes to adoption, always to secrecy. And what about the children, the ones who survived? Some were raised in adoptive families who never knew the truth. Some were told they had been abandoned. Some were raised in orphanages where records were falsified or destroyed. One woman, Sarah, began searching for her birth mother in her 40s. All she had was a birth certificate from a hospital run by a Catholic order and a single name: Sister Clara. No last name, no date of transfer, no photo. Her search led her through 3 countries over 6 years and into the hands of multiple church archivists who told her again and again, "We have no record." But records existed. Eventually, through a DNA match and a journalist's help, she found her mother living in a small town in Italy. Clara, no longer a sister, had never stopped grieving. She kept a photo of a newborn she'd never been allowed to hold, and she had believed for decades that her child had died. Their reunion, captured in a documentary, is painful and beautiful. 2 lives torn apart by lies, finding each other through persistence and courage. But not everyone gets that ending. Some mothers die still wondering. Some children never find the truth. Some stories vanish with time, which is why we must tell them now. There's another layer to this story, one we can't ignore. Some of the abuse and pregnancies were not the result of violence, but of manipulation cloaked in theology. Priests and spiritual directors convinced nuns that they were chosen, that their union was a divine mystery, that their intimacy was part of God's secret plan. This kind of spiritual grooming is perhaps the most insidious, because it doesn't feel like abuse, not at first. It feels like love, like purpose, like holiness, and by the time the woman realizes she has been used, it's often too late. Sister Miriam, from a convent in Eastern Europe, believed she was in a sacred relationship with her confessor. He told her their bond was like that of Mary and Joseph, pure, spiritual, secret. When she became pregnant, he told her it was a miracle. But the convent didn't agree. She was expelled, he was promoted. That's how this system worked. And if we don't speak of it, if we don't demand that the church open its archives, acknowledge its sins, and listen to the voices of survivors, then it will happen again. Some will say, the church has done so much good. It has served the poor, educated the masses, saved souls. Yes, and also this, both can be true. And if we want to preserve the good, we must uproot the evil. That begins with listening, with believing, with refusing to look away. If you're still watching this video, thank you. You are part of the healing. Please take a moment to like this video if you believe the truth should never be buried. Subscribe for more content like this, deep dives into stories that matter even when they hurt, and share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the church should publicly name every religious institution involved in these cover-ups, even if the events happened decades ago? Your opinion matters. Your voice could be the one that encourages someone else to speak up. We'll continue, because the truth deserves to be told. There's a sacred silence, and then there's the kind that kills. Over these past decades, too many women have borne the unbearable alone, taught that their suffering was holy, that their pain was private, that their voices were too disruptive for God's house. But what we've learned from their stories is that silence, when enforced to protect power, becomes a cage. It imprisons the truth. It shatters lives. The stories of pregnant nuns hidden from the world, of children born in secret and whisked away without a name, of women who gave their lives to faith only to be betrayed by the very institution they trusted, all of these carry echoes of one central question. Where was justice? Justice was not in the whispered confessions swept under the altar rugs. It was not in the relocation of abusive priests or the exile of pregnant women. It was not in the unmarked graves or sealed files or the insistence that obedience matters more than humanity. Justice, for many, never came, but maybe it still can. Justice begins with acknowledgement. It begins with us not turning away, with refusing to say, it's too painful, or that was a long time ago, or this can't be true. Because it was true, it is true, and it continues to be true in ways that are still being uncovered. But here's the hope. Truth is contagious. Every time a survivor speaks out, another one finds the courage to do the same. Every story cracks the wall a little more. Every testimony, no matter how long buried, brings light into places that have known only darkness. There's a reason the symbol of truth is light. It doesn't erase the past, it reveals it. And once something is revealed, it can be healed. Not quickly, not easily, but healing begins when someone says, I see you, I believe you. What happened to you was wrong. For the women who spent decades believing their pain was a punishment. For the children who grew up wondering why their mothers disappeared before they ever knew their names. For the nuns who suffered in silence, convinced that their obedience was more important than their dignity. We see you now, we believe you, and we will not let your stories be erased. This video is not just about exposing scandal, it's about creating space for remembrance and change. Because if we don't remember, we repeat. And if we don't demand change, we become complicit in silence. There are still convents operating today where rules of secrecy remain strict, where young women are told not to question authority, and where their bodies are seen not as sacred vessels, but as tools to serve an institution. There are still priests and clergy who have never faced justice. There are still hidden records, still silenced voices, still truths waiting for a listener. That listener can be you, because this isn't just about what happened, it's about what we do now. Do we let the buried stay buried, or do we insist that even the most painful truths deserve to be brought into the light? What happens when thousands, millions of us decide that faith and truth are not enemies, but allies? When we say that real holiness means protecting the vulnerable, not shielding the powerful, that real obedience means serving love, not fear. We believe in a world where stories like these are never buried again. A world where no woman is ever shamed for telling the truth. A world where faith doesn't hide behind power, but stands in front of it, demanding justice. That world begins with you. So if this story moved you, even if it shook you, disturbed you, or opened questions you never expected, don't let it end here. Click like, because these voices matter. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story like this again, because more are coming and they deserve to be heard. Turn on notifications so you'll know when truth speaks again. And most importantly, leave a comment. Tell us what you think. Should the Vatican release every sealed document, every hidden record connected to these events? Should the Church offer public global reparations to the victims of convent pregnancies and institutional cover-ups? Speak your truth. Say their names, because silence ends when we refuse to keep it. And the truth, no matter how long buried, always finds a way to rise.